This is an introduction to the book of 1 Samuel for Sunday school at GCBC. Why do we study 1 Samuel? Well, one author, Bergen, says this: the book of Samuel are masterful examples of ancient Hebrew narrative art. They possess all the characteristics of a timeless literary classic, a magnificent central plot involving kings, international wars, ambition, murder, deception, complex character portrayals, skillful use of varied settings ranging from mountains to deserts, and masterful use of wordplays and allusions. Another author suggests this: the Old Testament stories about Hannah and Peninnah, Samuel and Eli, Saul and David, David and Jonathan, David and Goliath, Samuel and the medium at Endor, have proven to be rich resources for countless sermons, lectures, and lessons through the centuries. Lots of reasons to look at 1 Samuel. But who is the author? Well, the book makes no claim as to authorship, but that's also true of other historical narrative books like Joshua, Judges, Kings, and Chronicles. Samuel dies in chapter 25 of 1 Samuel, so those chapters that go on beyond chapter 25 all the way to chapter 31, and then the second book of Samuel would have to be written by somebody else. The last words of David are recorded in 2 Samuel 23, verse 1, so we know an end date for at least David's possible involvement at 970 BC. Nathan and Gad may have composed some of 2 Samuel. 1 Corinthians 29:29 says this: now the acts of David from first to last are written in the chronicles of Samuel the seer, and in the chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and the chronicles of Gad the seer. So there may have been some additional authors to this book, but we just don't know. Well, what is historical narrative anyway? Well, 1 and 2 Samuel are part of the history of the people of Israel that date, in 1 and 2 Samuel's case, from Samuel's birth around 1100 BC to David's death in 970 BC. But they're part of a historical narrative. They are stories of God acting in history through people and events to bring about his purposes. It'll be fun to look at 1 Samuel and see God acting through people like David and Hannah and Saul and Samuel to bring about his purposes. And actually, when you read your Bible, about 65% of the Bible is historical narratives. So maybe we'll pick up some tips along the way for being able to understand them a little better. We should pay attention to the historical context. There's almost 100 years of narrative about various people and places. There's lots to learn here. And God is the main character. Look for God's purposes behind events and individuals. What does it tell us about God and his ways and how he works with events and people? And it's God's perspective on the history of Israel. Well, it's also a book of transition. If you look at the book, you can divide them in basically three parts: Samuel, the first 7 chapters, Saul, chapters 8 through 15, and David, chapters 16 through 31. We transition from a priest and a judge coming out of the book of Judges to Saul, who was the first king, to David, who becomes the king of a dynasty in the line of David and tribe of Judah, or kingdom of Judah. We go from a loose federation of tribes, like we saw in Judges, all the way over to a strong kingdom in David's time. We find at the beginning of Samuel that worship takes place at a shrine, and that there's a corrupt priesthood in the priest of Eli and his sons. And then we go on to Samuel, the prophet. And as we travel along in Samuel, we'll find that David buys a site for the temple. So eventually worship will take place in a central location where God dwells. And the kind of government is a theocracy, that God raises up judges to deliver his people. That came out of Judges, and it comes into Samuel, where he is the last judge, if you will. And there's a desire in chapter 8 and following of the people wanting to be like all the other nations and having a king who can lead their armies. But we have David, who is also a king that must obey God, a man after God's own heart. So God is still ruling. Well, how about some historical background? Well, it's the end of the period of the judges. No central leadership, no sanctuary, nothing but chaos. Judges says this in 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Sounds kind of like our day and time. No superpower controlling Palestine. But the Philistines continued to be a major enemy of Israel. They assimilated the Canaanite culture, their gods, their practices. They were the undefeated enemy in Joshua. They show up in Judges at times, and they certainly show up in Samuel. They had a highly developed technology and civilization when Saul and David were confronted by them around the 11th and 10th centuries of BC. In fact, they had a monopoly on iron tools and weapons for a long time. Well, 1 Samuel and the rest of the Old Testament are of interest. Originally, they were just one book in the Hebrew, later divided into two sections. In fact, 1 Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings were later divided into four sections by the Greek translation, or the Septuagint. Later, the Latin translation, the Vulgate, and of course, the Christian OT, Canaan. So we have today 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. The speculation is that to have put 1st and 2nd Samuel on one scroll would have been too large, so that may have been the reason they were divided into four sections. Samuel is part of the former prophets, along with Joshua, Judges, and Kings. The history of Israel from the period of Judges to the end of Judah. It's called former prophets because prophets often interact with the kings during this time. You'll find some parallel material in 1 Chronicles, which uses material from Samuel on Saul and David. Well, how about an outline of 1 Samuel? Well, we could break it down this way. Samuel as judge and prophet in chapters 1 through 7. We have the birth, the call, the start of his career, loss of the ark, and defeat of Philistines. Then we have Saul as the first king of Israel in chapter 8 through 15. There's warnings by Samuel the prophet about having a monarchy, but the people want one. And Saul's rise and reign as king, chapters 9 through 12. And then Saul's rejection as king in chapter 13 through 15 for disobedience. And the third part of 1 Samuel is David and Saul. In chapter 16 through chapter 31, we have David being anointed as king in chapter 16 by Samuel. We have the pursuit of David by Saul over most of those chapters. And finally, we have the death of Saul and his heir Jonathan in chapter 31 in battling the Philistines. Well, how about some themes in 1 Samuel to get us interested in looking at Samuel in more detail? Of course, God's sovereignty stands out. God uses the hardship in Hannah's relationship with Peninnah in 1 Samuel 1. He manages Saul's donkey-searching journey to lead to the encounter with the prophet Samuel. And David's chore bringing food to his brothers in the valley of Elah during the war enables him to see Samuel. Interesting how God's sovereignty works in common day events. Then prayer stands out in this book. There are some 50 references to prayer, including 23 of the 31 chapters. And of course, well-known prayers include Hannah's prayer for a son and David's prayer for guidance. There's a theme of reversal of fortune. God's choice of David, a shepherd, the least of the 8 sons of Jesse. It is customary for the Lord to bless the humble and raise them up, and to judge the proud and bring them down. And we find that in Samuel. Some more themes. Obedience. We have Saul failing to obey in 1 Samuel 15:22. Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams. 1 Samuel 15:22. Then we have a personal God who responds to the need of his people, where Hannah pours out her heart, her soul to God. We have repentance as they're turning away from sins that have caused separation from God and are returning unto God. But the return has to be wholehearted, implying there can be no divided loyalties or opinions when one returns to Yahweh. In the case of Samuel's appeal in 1 Samuel 7, repentance involved a repudiation of Israel's allegiance to Canaanite gods of fertility and a renewed commitment to serve Yahweh exclusively. So there's a turning away and a returning to God when it comes to repentance. We also find in 1 Samuel 15 that his repentance was not wholehearted. We find that he sinned because he feared the people rather than God. We find furthermore that David is a type or model of Jesus Christ. We'll find several references to that, including the fact that David was anointed king by Samuel in chapter 16. So, anointing a king appears first in 1 Samuel in the Old Testament in a number of places, including Saul. And the king as the Lord's anointed is frequent in 1 and 2 Samuel. If you recall, there are 2 occasions in chapter 24 and 26 where David refuses to harm the Lord's anointed, that is, the king Saul. Well, Messiah is simply a transliteration of the Hebrew noun Mashakah, meaning anointed one. When the use of this terminology is traced into the New Testament, we find the term Christos, or Christ, also meaning anointed one. It is the Greek equivalent for the Hebrew Messiah. So the idea of an anointed one, or Christ, begins in 1 Samuel. Furthermore, David is one who is after God's own heart, who carries out the will of God. We know that from chapter 13 of 1 Samuel, but Acts 13:22 picks this up as well. And the term son of David, 16 times in the New Testament, usually refers to Jesus. And of course, 2 Samuel 7:12 through 16, there's a covenant with David promising him an eternal kingdom, which ultimately is Christ's kingdom. So David is a type of Christ. Well, next week, the birth and dedication of Samuel. I hope you will enjoy it.